All right, so we're going to do section 1.2. This could be the shortest lecture of the semester, so let's hope I don't drag on something that should take a half hour to much longer than that. So the section 1.2 is titled Factoring by Grouping, and I should talk a little bit about what factoring by grouping, when we would use it, and then through the problems I'll show what it is. So factoring by grouping, sometimes I'll just say grouping as opposed to factoring by grouping, is used only when the given expression, in this case is an expression, or I'll say problem. This is an expression because it doesn't have an equal sign, has exactly 4 terms. So if the problem has 1 term, 2 terms, 3 terms, 5 terms, 6 terms, I wouldn't use grouping. And this method grouping, it will only work on problems that have exactly 4 terms, and it won't work on every problem with 4 terms. The problems have to be set up just so for this method to work. It's not my favorite method. In fact, I rarely use factoring by grouping. As we get deeper into this chapter, we'll show you different problems that you can use factoring by grouping for and ways to avoid factoring by grouping. It turns out that for me, grouping is such a specialized strategy, and it usually can be worked around, that I rarely wind up using it, so I'm not going to get crazy. That's why it's such a short section. They make me cover it, and it's kind of nice to be aware of grouping, just in case you stumble across a problem with 4 terms that you're asked to factor. But it's probably, of the skills that we're going to learn in Chapter 1, probably the least important skill. So to factor by grouping, it involves a problem with 4 terms being broken up into 2 groups of 2. So what I'm going to do to factor this by grouping is I'm going to break the problem into 2 groups. That's why it's called grouping, I suppose. And of 2. So I'm going to do, usually we do this with parentheses. So I'm going to take the x squared plus 3x, put it in one group, and the plus 4x plus 12, put it in the other group. I probably should have put the plus sign in front of this parentheses. If there's a minus sign right there between the second and third term, then putting the minus sign in the parentheses makes more sense than what I just did with the plus sign. So let me write equal signs because these equal the lines above them, and drag that plus sign out of the second parentheses. So I've done my first step. I've broke the problem into 2 groups. Now I'm going to factor the GCF from each group. So factor out a GCF from each group. When I finish this stage, the second step, I'll be left with 2 identical parentheses that I can factor out as a common factor. That's kind of the skill we did right at the end of section 1.1. So if you recently did 1.1, the last few problems in 1.1 are connected really tightly to this, what we're going to wind up doing next. So in my first parentheses, the x squared plus 3x, there's a common factor of an x. I'm going to factor out an x. I'll take one x away from the x squared and be left with a single x. I'll bring down this plus sign. I'll take one x away from the 3x and be left with a 3. I'm going to bring down this plus sign, and from the second group, I'm going to pull out a common factor, and it's a 4. To pull out a common factor of 4, I need to divide the numbers by 4. When I divide the 4x by 4, the 4 cancels, I'm left with the x. I bring down this plus sign, I divide the 12 by 4, and I'm left with a 3. Done with the second step. And then one more step. If on the second step you don't get a common parenthesis, then you likely made a mistake in this section, or the factoring by grouping doesn't work. Because factoring by grouping, the problems have to be set up just perfectly, and for them to be set up just perfectly, each of the groups, when you pull out a common factor, they have to be left with the same parentheses. And if that doesn't happen, in general, if I gave you 4 terms and you tried to factor by grouping, this wouldn't happen. You would, because the problems have to be set up just so. But in each problem between 1 and 36, if you do the second step right, factor out the GCF from each group, you're going to be left with identical parentheses that you can factor out. Remember how we did this in the last section? Here I'm going to factor out an x plus 3. So I'm going to take an x plus 3 away from each side. And from the first side, I'll be left with an x. And then after that, I'll be left with a plus 4. That's my answer. And if I want to check this answer, it's kind of the hard checking again, where I probably have to work on both problems to do my checking. So just to show you how I could check this. So if I wanted to check, I probably have to work on both my original problem and my answer. So the original problem can be simplified. So I'm going to work with the original problem. And in the original problem, I can add the 3x and 4x and get 7x. And now I'm going to work with my answer in my checking. And what happens is I'm able to make my answer look like the reworked original problem. So my answer I need to simplify by foiling. I'll do first, which are x times x, which is x squared. Outers are x times 4, which is plus 4x. Inners are 3 times x, which is plus 3x. And last are 3 times 4, which is plus 12. And I get x squared plus 7x plus 12, because multiplying out my answer and simplifying the original problem, because they simplify to exactly the same thing, I say my problem is factored correctly. So again, checking is more work. Usually you can just check your answer and multiply your answer, or go back to the original problem. But there's certain problems where the checking involves changing the original and changing my answer, and those are the kind of problems that the checking takes sometimes longer than the problems, and I often skip that checking. Okay, so I'm going to move on and do problem 4, and it's going to have the same vibe. So I'm going to do these steps. I'm going to break the problem into 2 groups. Oh, I forgot to lay down a sheet of paper here. The awesome Sharpies that I'm using, a student gave these to me, and I love the colors, but they bleed through it, so I have to put a sheet of paper under when I write, otherwise you get this stuff that clutters up the next page. But I love teaching with these colors. Oh, I'm not supposed to accept gifts, but apparently you're allowed to give me up to a $5 gift, and these 3 markers I don't think exceeded that, so I was excited to get them. So 4 is a tough problem because this negative sign. And when I break this into 2 groups, I'm going to include the negative in the second parentheses, just like I included the positive in the second parentheses in problem 2, but that positive, it doesn't really need to go there. But when you have a negative, when you break it into two groups, you do. So first thing I'm going to do is break to two groups. And the negative sign certainly should go inside the second parentheses. So I'm done with the first step. There's my two groups. Now I'm going to factor out the GCF from each group. So here, I'm going to factor out a GCF of x. That's the easy one. The second one, if the leading term is negative, you have to factor out the negative. And we factored out negatives in the last section, so hopefully you can handle this. So I'm going to factor out, the GCF would normally be 4. I'll factor out the opposite of the GCF, because anytime the first term is negative, you usually factor that negative out. And if you don't factor the negative out, your parentheses won't match up so nicely. So I broke it up into two groups. I'm going to factor out a greatest common factor from each group, and I even wrote down what the greatest common factor is. The first group, I'm going to factor out an x. When I take an x away from the x squared, I have one x away. I'll bring down the minus sign. When I take an x away from the 3x, I'm left with a 3. The second parentheses, I'm going to factor out a minus 4. And when I factor out minuses, I change the signs, and I divide by the number I factored out. So the minus sign here is going to turn to a plus, and I factored out a 4, so I'm going to divide by 4. Here I'm going to be left with a positive x. To do this, maybe better, I had a negative 4x in the parentheses. I factored out a negative 4. If I divide by what I factored out, you're left with a positive x. I had a positive 12 in my parentheses. I factored out a negative 4. If I divide by what I factor by, that tells me what I have left, and 12 divided by negative 4 is negative 3. I usually don't divide to show what's left in the parentheses, but I know that if I factor out a 4, I need to divide by 4, so that 4 would turn into a 1, that 12 would turn into a 3, and if I factor out a negative, I have to turn my signs. This negative turned to a positive, that positive turned to a negative. You can tell if you've messed up on this step, because if you don't get two identical parentheses, then either A, I messed up the problem and the grouping doesn't work, and in this section every problem grouping should work, or B, you messed up and you didn't factor out a common factor right. And it's usually, if you're going to get a mistake in this section, it's this kind of problem where you have to factor out a negative and switch signs. So I'm done with, I did broke into groups, I factored out the common factors, now I'm factoring out the common parentheses. So now I'm going to factor out the common parentheses. It would be nice if I put equal signs, because everything here is equal to the line above it. Even this, I think, is I'm not sure what to write here, because it almost looks like there's a times there. I tried to make the parentheses far enough apart. Really, I'm going to overcomplicate it and confuse things if I start saying too much, so I'll stop saying what I was about to say, because it would just confuse you. So the common parentheses is an x minus 3. When I take the x minus 3 away from that, I'm left with an x. When I take the x minus 3 away from that, I'm left with a 4. So the answer to problem 4 is x minus 3 times x minus 4. And if I wanted to check it, I'd have to go through the same process. I'd have to simplify this from 4 terms to 3 terms. I'd have to FOIL this and combine like terms. And I'd get the same checking as, the same kind of checking would happen like problem 2. You'd get two things that are equal to each other. Oh, right. So 6 is easier than 8. 6 doesn't have the negative in the bad place, so it's not going to be as complicated. I won't have to factor out a negative. 8 has a negative in the bad place, which is going to make it a little bit harder. So step 1, create two groups. So my first group is x squared plus x. My second group is plus 36x plus 36 And again, this plus sign doesn't really need to be in the parentheses. I can simply just bring that plus sign out without doing any changing. So when this sign is plus, my work is easy. This definitely equals the line above it. So that's step 1. I made my 2 groups. Step 2, pull out the common factor from each. First parentheses is a common factor of an x. I'm going to factor out an x. I'm going to take 1x away from the x squared. I'll be left with 1x. And if you factor out something completely, you have to leave a 1 behind. So I took this x away. I can't leave anything. I can't leave this thing after the plus sign blank, so I'll leave a 1 behind. Bring down my plus sign. Second parentheses is a common factor of a 36. When I divide this 36 by 36, I get a 1, but the x stays. I bring this plus sign down. When I divide this 36 by the 36 that I factored out, I get a 1. It's the end of my second step. Last step is to do the common parentheses, and this is going to give me my answer. Factor out the x plus 1. When I take the x plus 1 away from each piece, I'm left with an x and a plus 36. Second one's the tricky one. 8 is the tricky one, should I say. Make 2 groups. First group, x squared minus x. Second group, the negative needs to go inside the parentheses, and I need to factor that negative out. First parentheses, there's a common factor of an x. So here I'm going to factor out the GCF of x. When I factor out a GCF of an x, I started with 2 x's. I took 1 out, I'm left with 1x. I bring this minus sign down. I had an x, I factored it out completely. I need to leave a 1 behind. Second parentheses, the common factor is 36, but because the first term is negative, I have to factor out a negative with that 36. And that's going to cause me to change my signs or divide. To figure out what goes first, I had a negative 36x first. I factored out a negative 36, and when you divide, you're left with just a positive x because the 2 negatives cancel to be a positive. For the second piece, I had a positive 36. I factored out a negative 36, and I could always divide by what I factor out to figure out what goes inside the parentheses. And here I have a positive divided by a negative, so I get a negative, and 36 over 36 is 1. Again, the factoring by grouping only works if you get 2 identical parentheses. So if on your second step you don't get 2 identical parentheses, then you likely messed up on one of the common factorings. You probably didn't factor right. Now that I have it set up, I'm going to factor out the x minus 1 that each has in common. And then to the first one I have an x left over, the second one I have a minus 36 left over. So the big hard thing is knowing how to factor out negatives and knowing what's left. And for me, I knew that this negative was going to switch to a positive, and that positive was going to switch to a negative, because anytime you factor and put a negative in front of a parentheses, you have to flip the signs. Negative flip to positive, positive flip to negatives. So the 10 is the easy version, 12 is the hard version. They both have the same numbers, but 10 is way easier because I don't have to worry about factoring out any negatives. So I'm going to make my 2 groups, my y squared plus 6y, and then I'm just going to write plus 5y plus 30. I don't have to have the plus sign inside the parentheses, but I would have to have a minus sign inside the parentheses. Equal, because this definitely equals the line above it. When I don't have a sign between the parentheses, it kind of doesn't equal the line above it, but it's just kind of a temporary thing I write down to help me get to the answer. First parentheses is a common factor of a y. When I take 1y away from the 2y's, I'm left with 1y. When I take 1y away from the plus 6y, I'm left with a plus 6. I bring this plus sign down. Second group, there's a common factor of a 5. I write a 5 in front of a parentheses. From the 5y, when I factor out a 5, I have to divide by 5. The 5's cancel, I'm left with a y. Bring the plus sign down. 30, when you factor out a 5, you have to divide by 5, and 30 divided by 5 is 6. So I get 2 identical parentheses like I need to. And so my answer is going to be y plus 6 times y plus 5. Because when I write the y plus 6 first, I'm left with a y and a plus 5. 12 looks exactly the same. If you get clever at these, you might be able to figure out what the answer is without doing any of the grouping. That'd be kind of cool if you could. But for 12, I'm going to go y squared minus 6y and minus 5y plus 30. First one, there's a common factor of a y, so I'll factor out a y. I'll be left with a y minus 6. Second one, because the first thing in the parentheses is negative, I have to factor out a negative. And the common factor between 5y and 30 is the 5. To figure out what goes in the parentheses, if I can't just do it in my head, you could take what's initially in the parentheses and divide it by what you factor out. The negative 5y, when I factor out a negative 5, I have to divide by negative 5. The two negative 5's cancel, become a positive 1. They leave me a y. And what happens to the positive 30, when you factor out a negative 5, you have to divide 30 by negative 5, and you get negative 6. Again, I can do this step in my head, but if you're having a hard time getting the parentheses to match up, it's probably this side that's messing you up, and this is a way, a foolproof way of doing it. If you factor out a negative, you can take each thing inside the parentheses and divide by that negative. So common factor of y minus 6, and cancel that out there, cancel that out there. That leaves me with a y minus 5. So my answer is y minus 6 times y minus 5. Good, notice that 10 and 12 are kind of the same problems, and the answers are kind of the same answers, except the positives are in problem 10 and the negatives are in problem 12. If you looked at problem 6 and 8, 6 and 8 are kind of the same problem, except 6 has a plus x and a plus 36. 8 has a minus x and a minus 36. If you look at the answers for 6, double plus, 8, double minus, but everything else is the same. That's not a coincidence. That's going to happen every time you get two essentially identical polynomials with 4 terms. If everything's the same and you have 2 pluses and 2 minuses, then they're going to factor pretty much so the same. So it should be the case for 14 and 16. 14 and 16, same deal. I have the same 4 terms, one with a double plus, one with a double minus. I probably could just do 14 and then gamble on what my answer for 16 is without doing any work, because I think I know what it is, but I'm not going to do that. I'll do all the work, but I probably could get the answer without doing any work. So I'm making my 2 groups. The second group doesn't need a sign in it because of the plus. First group, there's a common factor, and that common factor has both a number and a letter. Both the numbers are divisible by 5, and both terms have an x. The common factor from the first 2 is a 5x. So I'm going to divide the numbers by 5 and take an x away. When I divide 5 by 5, I get a 1. From 2 x's, when I take 1 x away, I'm left with 1x. I bring down this plus sign. When I divide 10 by 5, I get a 2. I took its x away, so that's what I'm left with. Bring down this plus sign. Next parentheses has a common factor of just the number 3. Divide this by 3, I'll be left with an x. Divide the 6 by 3, I'm left with a positive 2. Again, if on the second step you don't see identical parentheses, then you have done something wrong in your grouping. So now we have the last step. They both have an x plus 2 in common. When I factor out that x plus 2, first I'm left with a 5x, second I'm left with a plus 3. 16, I'm going to make this 5x squared minus 10x and minus 3x plus 6. First, it still has a common factor of 5x. So I'm going to write a 5x, then a parentheses, and this definitely equals the original problem. And I divide by 5, take an x away. When I divide by 5, it turns into a 1. I have x squared, I take an x away, I'm left with 1x. Bring down this minus sign. 10 divided by 5 is 2, and I took that x and factored it out, so I left with an x minus 2. Next pair has a common factor of 3, but because the first term is negative, I have to factor out a negative 3. When I factor out a negative 3, I can divide the two things in the parentheses by -3 to figure out what goes inside the parentheses if I just don't know intuitively. The first piece, -3 over -3, cancels to be a +1. I'm left with just an x. The second piece, 6 divided by -2, is -3. I'm supposed to divide by -3. I don't know why I decided to write 2. I'm supposed to go 6 over -3 because I factored out a -3. I need to divide by -3, and I should have written -2 here. If this would have came out to -3, then the parentheses wouldn't have matched up, and I knew I would. That's how I knew I was getting a mistake, because I was getting ready to go 6 over -2 is -3, and I didn't have two identical parentheses, which means I knew I made a mistake. Now I can write my answer probably pretty quickly. I don't need to do the scratching out really. I'm going to factor out the common factor of x minus 2. To the left, I have a 5x left over, and then a -3. So again, look at the answers. Basically the same. One has an x and the 2, the other one has a 5x and a 3. You have a double plus and a double minus. Again, that's not a coincidence. The first group of problems here, we're all set up to make that happen. Eventually we'll get off of these, I think. But not yet. We've got another 2. We have another 2 just like that. Double plus and double minus. So for problem 18, I'm going to go 4y squared plus 12y, and then plus y plus 3. This is a good trick, because the second parentheses might stump you if you haven't seen this trick. First parentheses is not so tricky. Both 4 and 12 are divisible by 4. Both of them have a y. The smaller exponent of y is y to the first. The common factor is 4y. When I divide this by 4 and take one of the two y's away, I'm left with a y. I bring down this plus sign. When I divide the 12 by 4, I'm left with a 3. I took the y away, so y plus 3 is left over. All of a sudden, I look at this. Both terms don't have the same letter, so there's not a letter common factor, and there isn't a number I could factor out either. When there isn't a common factor, you still need a number to throw in front of, to throw in front of the parentheses. If there's not a common factor, I put a 1 in front of my parentheses, because 1 times anything is it. So I'm kind of fudging a little bit here to make grouping work. But I need something to the left of the parentheses. And this right here, 1 times y plus 3, it equals y plus 3. So this does equal the line above it. So it's a trick, but it's a legal trick because it's a true statement. Now I've got my double y plus 3, so I can factor out a y plus 3. And I'm left with a 4y plus 1. And again, you might be able to predict the answer to number 20, because 18 and 20 are essentially the same. So their answers should be essentially the same, except they have different signs, so their answers are going to have different signs. So I'm going to make my groups. First group, 4y squared minus 12y. Second group, minus y plus 3. First group, I'm factoring out a 4y again. When I divide the 4 by 4, I get a 1. I had 2 y's. I factored 1 out. I'm left with 1 y. I bring down my minus sign. I divide 12 divided by 4 and get a 3. I factored out the y, so I don't get a letter. Second group, there's not a common factor, but there's a negative in front of the y, so I'm going to factor out a negative, and I have to factor out a 1 when there's not a common factor. When you factor out a -1, inside the parentheses you put the opposite. The opposite of negative y is positive y. The opposite of positive 3 is negative 3. And again, it has to happen that these parentheses match up. If at any of these problems you don't get the parentheses to match up, then you've done something wrong. So now I'm going to factor out the y minus 3 that they have in common, and I'm left with a 4y minus 1. You look at my answers again, they're essentially the same, except the signs are messed up a little bit. They're just not the same. The only thing different is the signs. That's the only thing different in the problem is the signs. (22) and 24 are different but similar. They're different in, I don't have a double plus and a double minus. I have a plus minus and a minus plus. But I think it's going to be the same because they all have 2z squared, 14z, z, and 7. I think it's going to happen again where my answers are going to be the same other than the signs. And let's see if that happens. So first one, I'm going to go 22. I'm going to go 2z squared plus 14z. And the second one, I'm going to go minus z and minus 7. From the first pair, I'm going to factor out a 2z. And when I factor out a 2z, I divide the 2 by 2 and get 1. I add 2 z's. I factored out 1. I'm left with 1 z. I bring down my plus sign. I divide the 14 by 2 and get 7. I factored out its z. The second pair doesn't have a common factor because they both don't have letters and both the numbers aren't divisible by 7. So I'm just going to factor out the negative 1 because if the first term is negative, I always have to factor out a negative. And if I factor out a negative 1, inside the parentheses I put the opposite. The opposite of negative z is positive z. The opposite of negative 7 is positive 7. Now I'm going to write the z plus 7. Cancel it out. And I'm left with a 2z minus 1. So in the first group of problems, I had double pluses and double minuses in my answer. This is the first time where I have a plus and a minus. I don't know how that's going to, well, I do know, but you may not be able to predict yet how that's going to impact 24. So for 24, I'm going to make one group of 2z squared minus 14z, and then plus z minus 7. First group, there's a common factor of 2z. I'll divide the 2 by 2 and take away one of these z's and have a z there. Bring down this minus sign, divide that 14 by 2 and get a 7. I took its z away. Second pair, there's no negative to factor out and there isn't a common factor, so I'm going to factor out a 1. And when I factor out a 1, I can leave the contents of the parentheses the same because factoring out a 1 doesn't change the contents of the parentheses. Now we have a z minus 7 in common, so I'm going to write that z minus 7 first. I can actually write it. Ooh. And then I'm left with a 2z plus 1. Now if you look at the answers are similar, except now you have a plus and a minus. Here I have a minus and a plus. I had a plus and a minus. Here I had a minus and a plus. I don't suspect that's a coincidence. And it isn't. Hopefully I have more like this. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But it's kind of nice to see how problems that look the same but have different signs, their answers factor the same but have different signs. That's kind of happens in factoring. Oh, don't have any more of those. All right, so now, these are actually nice problems, 26 and 28. When I don't have any minuses, for me it's the easiest. So I loaded up the beginning of the section with all the minus problems because the minuses are harder. So for 26, I'm going to go y cubed plus 8y squared plus 4y plus 32. So I made my two parentheses. Could and should put an equal sign because that equals the line above it. And first one, I'm going to factor out a y squared. When I take 2 y's away from 3 y's, I'm left with 1 y. When I take 2 y's away from 8y squared, the y's are gone, but I still have the plus 8. Bring down my plus sign. In the second parentheses, the biggest number I can factor out is a 4. When I divide the 4 by 4, it cancels, but I'm left with a y. When I divide the 32 by 4, I'm left with an 8. So now they have y plus 8 in common. And I'm left with y squared plus 4. (28), same sort of idea. First parentheses with the first two terms. Don't need to keep the plus sign inside that second parentheses. Second parentheses 10z squared plus 50. First parentheses, there's just a z that they have in common. I take the smaller exponent, so I get a z to the first power. When I take one z away from the 3 z's, I'm left with 2 z's. When I take a z away from the 5z, the z's gone, but I still have the 5 left over. Bring this plus sign down. Between the 10 and the 50, they're both divisible by 10. 10 is the common factor. I'm going to divide that 10 by 10 and get a 1, but still leave the z squared. I'm going to divide that 50 by 10 and get a 5. The nice thing about grouping is you can just tell immediately if you have a mistake, because if the parentheses match up, the chances of you having a mistake are about 0. If the parentheses don't match up, you almost guaranteed you have a mistake. Now I'm going to write my z squared plus 5, factor it out, and I'm left with a z plus 10. So my answer to 28 is going to be z plus 5, z squared plus 5 times z plus 10. Thirty's also nice because I have nothing but pluses. First parentheses is x cubed plus 4x squared plus x plus 4. First parentheses, a common factor of an x squared. When I take 2 x's away from the x cubed, I'm left with 1x. There, I'll take the x squared all the way away and be left with a plus 4. Second parentheses, both numbers aren't divisible by 4. Both don't have an x. I'm just going to write a 1 for my common factor. Now they have x plus 4 parentheses in common. And I'm left with an x squared plus 1. (32), I get back to the minuses. First parentheses, x cubed plus 9x squared. Second parentheses, stick that minus in the parentheses. First parentheses has a common factor of x squared. When I take 2 x's away from the 3x, I'm left with 1x. When I take 2 x's away from the 9x squared, the x squared is gone, I'm left with a plus 9. There isn't a common factor in the second parentheses, but I can factor out a negative 1. And when I factor out a negative 1, I write the opposite. Inside the parentheses, the opposite of negative x is positive x. The opposite of negative 9 is positive 9. Now they have an x plus 9 in common. And I'm left with an x squared minus 1. If you have recently taken like a high school course or a different algebra course, or you took this course and you failed it, it would be okay, but way too premature to realize that the x squared minus 1 parentheses could actually be split up more. This strategy, breaking this 1 parentheses into 2 parentheses, I think that's section 1.5 and way too premature. But there's got to be 3 or 4 or 6 students watching this that already know how to factor, and they might remember that little twist. And that's way too premature. If you just got to there, that's all you need to get to. But it's the first problem where I noticed, there's something else that factors more. And that's a skill that by the end of this chapter that you're going to have. You'll look at this and go, that's not completely factored. And you'll look at that and say, that is completely factored, but that's well beyond where we need to be right now. So right here is where that would be the answer that I would expect, if there's 20 people in the class, 19 of them to write. Last few problems. 30, no ugly negatives either, good. So first one I go 34, I go x cubed minus 2x squared plus 20x minus 5. First one I'm going to factor out a 2 and an x squared, because both 2 and 8 are divisible by 8, and the smallest exponent that the x's have in common are x squared. So I'm going to factor out a 2x squared. The first piece, I'll go 8 divided by 2 is 4. I had 3 x's, I took 2 away, I'm left with 1x. Bring down the minus sign, and anytime in front of the parentheses I have exactly one of the things inside the parentheses, you leave a 1 behind there. Bring down my plus sign. Between 20 and 5, there's a common factor of a 5. When I divide 20 by 5, I'm left with a 4. I bring down the x. I bring down the minus sign. When I divide 5 by 5, I get 1. So this is going to be 4x minus 1 times 2x squared plus 5. Last one. I should probably write the answer, but generally the last thing I write's the answer. So for this one, I'm going to go 4x cubed plus 5x squared plus 12x plus 15. First one, I'm going to factor out an x squared. When I factor out an x squared, this had 3 x's. I take 2 of them away. I'm left with 1x. I still have the 4. This had 2 x's. I took the 2 x's away. Now I'm just left with the plus 5. Second group, there's a common factor of a 3. Put a 3 in front of the parentheses. 12 divided by 3 is 4. I keep the x. Bring my plus sign down. 15 divided by 3 is 5. They both have a 4x plus 5 in common. So my answer is going to be 4x plus 5 times x squared plus 3. So I know I kind of did the common factoring kind of quick. Most students do common factoring pretty quick. If you don't do the common factoring quick, that's completely okay. You're going to have plenty of time on the test to do common factoring at the pace that you need to do it at. But it is something you should strive to do fast, because common factoring comes up a lot, and to be able to do it at a decent clip is just, it's good for you if you can. But you have to see numbers. I look at the numbers and I see them, and it makes it easy for me. If you're struggling to find common factors, then it's just going to take you longer. But it's completely okay. Always welcome to come by my office. I can make you up a bunch more problems, and I can sit with you one-on-one to help you figure out, how do I find the common factors so quick? Maybe I can give you some tips to find common factors quicker if you're not finding common factors easy enough. All right, so that's that, and the next section is more factoring. This whole chapter is more factoring, and the next section is another friendly-ish section, so I hope these first 2 sections felt kind of a relief compared to some of the stuff we did in Chapter P.